I thought rock bottom was just a saying, until I lost my job and my wife in the same week. For months, I felt like a ghost drifting through my own life. But one unexpected email changed everything, proving that sometimes the worst endings are just disguised beginnings. I used to think rock bottom was an exaggeration. Something people said when their car broke down twice in a week or when they got passed over for a promotion. Turns out, it's a very real place, and I somehow managed to take up residence there for a few months. It started with my job. I worked at a mid-sized logistics company, one of those offices that smell faintly of burnt coffee and printer ink. My title sounded impressive enough, operations coordinator. In reality, I was the guy who smoothed over everyone else's mistakes. If a shipment got delayed or an invoice went missing, it somehow landed on my desk. For years, I handled it without complaint. But last winter, things started to unravel. My supervisor, a man who spoke exclusively in management jargon, began dropping hints about realignment. Then came budgetary pressures. It didn't take a genius to decode that. When he started scheduling me for catch-ups that mysteriously included HR, I knew I was in trouble. At home, things weren't much better. My wife, Natalie, had grown distant, like she was living a few seconds ahead of me in some invisible timeline I couldn't reach. She'd started taking long, yoga classes that somehow left her sweaty but without a mat. I didn't want to believe the worst, but the signs were piling up like overdue bills. The day everything collapsed came in two waves. First, the company let me go, restructuring, they called it, which apparently meant replacing me with software. I packed my box, trying not to make eye contact with the intern who'd probably run my old reports from now on. When I got home early, Natalie wasn't there. Her car was missing, her phone went straight to voicemail. Out of habit, I opened her laptop on the counter, mainly to look for the recipe she'd been talking about the night before. Instead, I found messages. Dozens of them. I didn't even need to scroll far to get the picture. It's strange how quiet a house can get after that kind of discovery. I remember sitting on the couch for an hour, staring at nothing. The refrigerator hummed like it was trying to fill the silence. I didn't cry. I just felt hollow, like someone had scooped the center out of me and left the shell behind. Over the next few weeks, I went through the motions, unemployment forms, half-hearted job applications, microwave dinners. I'd always prided myself on being steady, reliable. But now, reliability didn't mean much when there was no one to rely on me. One night, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by job postings and a mug of cold coffee. I realized I didn't even know what I wanted anymore. The job I'd lost hadn't made me happy. The marriage had been fading long before it broke. I was suddenly free, but not in the exciting way people mean when they say that word. It felt more like drifting in open water with no shore in sight. That was when I got an email from an old college friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. He said he'd started a small tech firm and needed someone who could organize chaos. He remembered me as the guy who used to fix everyone's project messes back in school. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry at the timing. I stared at that email for a long time, hovering over the reply button. Something in me hesitated, not from doubt, exactly, but from exhaustion. Still, I typed a quick response and hit send. The next morning, I got a message back, "Can you start Monday?" I wasn't sure if it was the start of something better or just another temporary fix. But for the first time in weeks, I felt something close to curiosity. And maybe, in a quiet way, that was enough to move forward. I didn't realize then that saying yes to that one email would end up changing everything. Starting that new job felt like stepping into someone else's life by accident. The office was tucked inside a renovated warehouse, all exposed brick and recycled wood desks. It smelled faintly of coffee beans and ambition. Everyone was younger than me by at least 5 years, and most of them wore sneakers to work. On my first day, I stood there in a button-down and leather shoes, feeling like I'd brought a briefcase to a skateboard park. My old friend, well, former classmate, really, was named Kevin. He'd always been one of those people who could make chaos look like strategy. Back in college, he'd wing entire group projects and somehow still pull A's. Seeing him now, running a team of 20 developers, didn't surprise me as much as it probably should have. He greeted me with a grin and said something about how the place needed grown-up energy. I wasn't sure if that was a compliment or a polite way to say I looked exhausted. Either way, I appreciated it. I needed the distraction. After the last few months, even fluorescent lighting and Slack notifications felt like progress. The company itself was still finding its shape. They built scheduling software for freight carriers, ironically close to my old world of logistics. But where my last office had been buried under procedure, this one thrived on motion. People threw ideas across the room like ping-pong balls, and somehow it all came together into working code. My job was to keep those ping-pong balls from hitting the floor. Kevin called it operations, but it was really triage with spreadsheets. It took a few weeks before I stopped waking up with that knot in my stomach. I was still sorting through the emotional debris of my marriage. Natalie had moved out quietly, leaving behind a few boxes and a handwritten note that said she hoped I'd find peace. Peace wasn't the word I would have chosen, but at least there wasn't any shouting or drama. She'd made her choice, and I had to make mine, to keep going. On Fridays, the office had a tradition: everyone gathered in the break room for pizza and updates. It was the sort of team bonding event I used to dread, but here, it felt oddly comforting. The group had that mix of energy and awkwardness that made conversation easy. There was a designer named Leah who always brought homemade cookies. She laughed easily and seemed to have a story for everything. I noticed she stayed after to clean up long after everyone else had wandered off. I started doing the same, half to help, half because I wasn't in a hurry to go home to an empty apartment. One evening, while stacking paper plates, Leah mentioned she used to work in shipping logistics too. That caught my attention. We ended up talking about the absurdities of that world, how people spent hours arguing about the difference between delayed and rescheduled. It was small talk, but it didn't feel small. For the first time in months, I found myself genuinely laughing. Outside of work, my life was still in slow repair. I started running again, not far, just enough to feel my heartbeat for reasons other than anxiety. I sold my old dining set, the one Natalie had picked out, and replaced it with a plain wooden table from a thrift store. Somehow that small act made the apartment feel more mine. By mid-spring, things were stabilizing. I had a routine, co-workers I liked, and a sense of forward momentum. But part of me couldn't shake the feeling that this stability was fragile, like I was balancing something precious on a thin edge. Maybe that's why I volunteered for a new client project when no one else wanted it. It involved a major logistics firm, big money, tight deadlines, the kind of challenge that could either impress Kevin or ruin my reputation in a week. Kevin raised an eyebrow when I offered to take it. "You sure you want that mess?" he asked. I said yes before he could talk me out of it. I needed something to prove, to him, to the team, maybe mostly to myself. That project would end up testing me in ways I couldn't have imagined. It started with late nights and endless spreadsheets, but soon, I began noticing inconsistencies in the data that didn't make sense. At first, I assumed it was just a mistake, someone copying numbers wrong. But the deeper I looked, the clearer it became that something wasn't adding up at all. And once again, I found myself standing at the edge of a mystery I hadn't asked for. Only this time, I had something worth protecting, a second chance I didn't want to lose. The inconsistency in that project data started small enough to ignore: one invoice out of place, a missing line item, a delivery confirmation that didn't match its timestamp. I told myself it was just part of the learning curve. Every company had its quirks, and this client was massive. But the deeper I went, the stranger it got. Shipments were being double-billed under slightly altered company names, and certain tracking codes led to nowhere. I mentioned it casually to Kevin one morning, expecting him to shrug it off or tell me to file a ticket with accounting. Instead, he frowned and told me to keep an eye on it, but not to stir anything until we knew for sure. That was his polite way of saying tread carefully. Big clients meant big contracts, and big contracts meant we couldn't afford to spook anyone without proof. So, I dug in quietly. Nights turned into long hours at my desk, headphones in, screens glowing long after most of the team had gone home. I wasn't even sure what I was hoping to find, just that something about the numbers didn't sit right. Maybe it was the same instinct that used to help me spot shipping errors back at my old job. Or maybe I was just trying to prove that I wasn't the guy who always found out about bad news too late. One night, Leah stopped by my desk on her way out. She asked why I was still there. I told her I was just finishing up a few things, which was only half a lie. She smiled in that easy, knowing way she had and left a cookie on the corner of my desk before leaving. It sounds silly, but that small gesture hit me harder than it should have. It had been a long time since anyone had shown me uncomplicated kindness. By the end of the week, I found a pattern that couldn't be coincidence. A subcontractor's name kept appearing in transaction records even though their partnership with our client had supposedly ended months earlier. Payments were still being routed through them, large ones, at odd intervals. Someone was siphoning money, using outdated accounts as cover. I sat back in my chair, feeling that mix of dread and adrenaline that comes when you realize you've stumbled into something bigger than you meant to. I wasn't sure if I should tell Kevin right away or keep looking. Before I could decide, my screen went dark. The power blinked out across the office, just a flicker, maybe a surge, but when it came back, one of my files was corrupted. The spreadsheet I'd been working on for hours now opened as gibberish. I had backups, but the timing rattled me. It was probably nothing, but it felt like someone, or something, didn't want me digging further. That night, as I walked out into the cool air of the parking lot, I couldn't shake the uneasy sense that I was being watched. Over the weekend, I tried to switch off. I went for a run, cooked an actual meal, even texted an old friend I hadn't talked to since the divorce. But my mind kept drifting back to the data. The more I thought about it, the more it felt like a test. Not from Kevin or the client, but from life itself, like I'd been given a second chance just to see what I'd do when things got murky again. When Monday came, I decided to loop Kevin in. He listened carefully while I laid out what I'd found, tapping a pen against his notebook. He didn't say much, just nodded and told me he'd handle it. That sounded reassuring, but something about his tone didn't sit right. It wasn't dismissive, it was cautious. Almost too cautious. That afternoon, I noticed the project folder had been moved to a restricted drive. My access permissions were suddenly limited. Kevin said it was for security reasons, which made sense, but I couldn't help feeling I'd been quietly nudged out of the loop. For a few days, I tried to let it go. Focus on other tasks. Smile during team lunches. Pretend everything was normal. But every time I saw Kevin on the phone or in closed-door meetings, that old, hollow feeling crept back in, the one I'd felt when my marriage was unraveling and I could sense the truth before anyone said it out loud. One evening, as I was heading out, Leah caught up with me in the parking lot. She said she'd heard whispers about the project being messy, and wanted to know if everything was okay. I told her it was fine, though my voice didn't sound convincing even to me. She gave me a thoughtful look and said, "Sometimes the things that look like problems are actually doors." I didn't fully understand what she meant at the time. But she was right. That whole mess was about to open a door I hadn't even known existed, and it would lead to everything that came next. Looking back, that project was the hinge point. Everything before it was survival, everything after was change. 2 weeks after Kevin restricted my access, things started to shift in subtle ways. Meetings I used to be included in suddenly happened without me. Email chains stopped halfway through my name. Even Leah mentioned that Kevin seemed distracted whenever my project came up. It wasn't paranoia, I'd been quietly sidelined. Then, one Friday morning, Kevin called me into his office. His tone was casual, but his eyes were sharper than usual. He thanked me for catching the irregularities and said the client had been handled. The phrasing struck me, handled, not resolved. He explained that the issue went beyond our pay grade, and that our firm was stepping back from that portion of the contract. He framed it as a win, damage controlled, client relationship intact. But something about the whole conversation felt rehearsed. When I asked what would happen to the subcontractor, he just said, these things have a way of working themselves out, and changed the subject. I left his office feeling like I'd brushed against something half buried. I told myself it didn't matter. I had a stable job, new friends, and something that was finally beginning to resemble peace. But at night, when the noise of the day quieted down, I kept replaying that meeting in my head. A few days later, Leah stopped by my desk again. She looked hesitant, like she was deciding whether to say something. Finally, she told me that one of the developers, Mark, a quiet guy who always wore headphones, had been tasked with scrubbing data from the client files I'd flagged. He didn't know why, but he said Kevin had instructed him to delete backups older than 2 months. That wasn't standard procedure. Not even close. I didn't want to believe it, but the math was simple: someone was covering tracks. Whether it was Kevin or someone above him, I couldn't tell. I thought about confronting him, but something stopped me. The truth was, I wasn't sure what confronting him would even accomplish. Instead, I did something I hadn't planned on doing again: I took a risk. I still had partial access to archived reports stored on our cloud system. Over the next few evenings, I quietly exported every relevant record I could find and saved it to a personal drive. I wasn't planning to expose anyone, I just couldn't stand the thought of being the guy who looked away. A week later, everything blew open. The client, one of the country's largest logistics providers, announced a full-scale audit after discovering financial discrepancies. The subcontractor name I'd flagged was at the center of it. Industry headlines called it a data oversight. I knew better. Our company's involvement was minimal, but enough to draw attention. Within days, Kevin resigned for personal reasons. The office mood shifted overnight. Whispers, tension, fear of layoffs. But through it all, I felt oddly calm. I'd been through worse, and this time, I wasn't the one falling apart. When HR called me in for questioning, I told them everything I knew, factually, calmly, with no accusations. They thanked me, said I'd done the right thing, and that was that. For a while, it looked like the company might not survive the bad press. But as it turned out, the board decided to restructure. They needed someone who could rebuild operations from the ground up, someone steady, organized, and trusted. Somehow, that person ended up being me. I didn't celebrate. I'd learned by then that success isn't always a moment of joy, sometimes it's just quiet relief. In the months that followed, Kevin's name disappeared from internal chatter. The company regained footing. We downsized, rebuilt, and found new clients. I started to feel like I was steering something solid again, not just holding it together with duct tape and hope. And somewhere amid that chaos, Leah and I started spending more time together. Not in any grand or cinematic way. It began with lunch breaks that ran long, or carpooling to off-site meetings, or simply sharing the quiet understanding of two people who'd seen too much office drama to be impressed by it anymore. One evening, after another long day of rebuilding spreadsheets and trust, she said, almost offhandedly, "You know, you're different when you're not fixing someone else's mess." I didn't know what to say to that. But I thought about it for days afterward. Maybe she was right. Maybe, for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't defined by cleaning up after someone else's disaster. I was building something of my own. I didn't know it yet, but that realization would change more than just my career. It would shape the next chapter of my life in ways I couldn't have predicted. Because not long after that conversation, I got an email that would shift everything again, one that had nothing to do with work, and everything to do with what comes after survival. The email came late on a Thursday night, long after I'd stopped checking my inbox out of habit. I was sitting on my couch, half watching a cooking show I didn't care about, when the notification popped up. It was from Natalie. For a few seconds, I just stared at her name. I hadn't heard from her since the divorce papers had gone through. No calls, no social media likes, not even an accidental, "How are you?" text. The subject line was simple: "I owe you an apology." I hesitated before opening it. Some part of me knew that nothing good ever starts with those words. Still, curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a short, neat paragraph written in her careful, deliberate style. She said she'd been in therapy, that she finally understood the damage she'd caused. She didn't want to get back together, she was clear about that, but she wanted me to know she was sorry, and that I deserved the kind of peace she couldn't give. I didn't know how to react. Anger would have been easier, but it didn't come. I just sat there quietly, rereading the words, realizing that for the first time, they didn't have the power to shake me. I closed my laptop and went for a walk around the block. The air was cool, the streets half empty, and I felt something strange, something like forgiveness sneaking in where bitterness used to live. The next morning, I deleted the email. Not out of spite, but because I didn't need it anymore. Life at the office was steady now. The company had regained its rhythm, and I'd grown into my new role. There was a quiet satisfaction in seeing things run smoothly again, especially knowing I'd helped steer them that way. But outside of work, I was beginning to realize I'd built my identity around being busy. If I wasn't fixing something or chasing a deadline, I didn't know what to do with myself. Leah noticed. She always did. One Friday, after a late meeting, she mentioned that a few of the team were going hiking that weekend and asked if I wanted to come along. I almost said no, it had been years since I'd done anything outdoorsy, but I caught myself before the automatic refusal slipped out. I said yes. That Saturday, we met at a trail about an hour outside the city. It was one of those crisp early summer mornings where everything smells like pine and sunlight. The group set off ahead, but Leah and I fell into an easy pace behind them. The trail wound through tall trees and soft dirt, and the air was filled with the sound of insects and wind moving through leaves. It wasn't romantic, not yet. It was just comfortable. Like two people quietly realizing they didn't have to try so hard around each other. Somewhere near the top, we stopped to catch our breath and looked out over a valley that stretched endlessly in every direction. Leah said, "I used to think getting lost was the worst thing that could happen to someone. Now I think it's how you figure out where you're supposed to be." It wasn't profound on paper, but in that moment, it landed differently. Maybe because I'd spent so long trying to find direction that I'd forgotten what it felt like to simply stand still and appreciate the view. That day marked a quiet shift. We started spending more time together outside of work, not intentionally at first, but gradually. Coffee runs became weekend walks, then dinners that didn't involve team talk. There was no rush, no pressure. Just a sense that we were both healing from something and doing it at the same pace. Around that time, the board offered me a permanent executive role, director of operations. It came with more responsibility, a better salary, and the kind of recognition I'd once thought was the ultimate goal. But when I got the offer letter, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grateful. That was new for me. The night after I accepted, I sat on my balcony with a cup of tea and thought about how strange life can be. Less than a year earlier, I'd been jobless, heartbroken, and completely adrift. Now I was stable, respected, even content. Not happy yet, but close enough to see what happy might look like. Leah texted me that evening, congratulating me on the promotion. I told her I couldn't have done it without her calm in the storm. She replied, "Maybe the storm's what makes us learn how to steer." That line stayed with me. Maybe we don't get to choose our storms, but we do get to choose how we come out of them. And for the first time, I had the feeling that I was finally walking towards something good, something real. What I didn't know was that life still had one more surprise waiting. Not another disaster, but the kind of unexpected turn that quietly rewrites the rest of your story. By the end of that summer, Leah and I had fallen into an easy rhythm that didn't need labeling. We carpooled to work sometimes, cooked dinner at each other's places when the week ran long, and occasionally spent weekends wandering antique shops or farmers' markets without really buying anything. It wasn't the kind of whirlwind romance that people write songs about. It was steadier, slower, something that felt earned instead of found. At first, I worried it was too soon. My marriage had ended less than a year before, and I didn't want to drag any of that leftover wreckage into something new. But Leah never pushed. She had this quiet way of making space for silence, as if she understood that healing wasn't about rushing toward noise but learning how to sit comfortably in calm. One evening, we were working late on a client proposal. Everyone else had gone home, and the office lights had dimmed to that golden hour glow that makes even spreadsheets look poetic. Leah was reviewing a presentation slide when she said, almost absent-mindedly, "You know, you seem lighter these days." I asked what she meant. She said, "When you first started here, you looked like someone who was waiting for another shoe to drop. Now you look like you finally put the shoes away." It made me laugh, but she wasn't wrong. Somewhere along the line, I'd stopped living in reaction to things. My days weren't about damage control anymore, they were about progress. I wasn't waking up dreading the next problem. I was actually looking forward to what might happen next. Our company was thriving again. We'd landed a major new contract, and the team had grown from 20 to nearly 50 people. My new title still felt strange to say out loud, but I'd earned it honestly. Every challenge felt like a reminder that I'd rebuilt not just a career, but a sense of direction. Then, one morning in early fall, Leah handed me a folded piece of paper during our weekly meeting. She said it was something she'd been thinking about and wanted me to read when I had time. I unfolded it after she left. It was her resignation letter. She'd been offered a creative director role at a design agency across the country, her dream job. The kind she'd talked about in passing but never thought she'd actually get. I read the letter twice, trying to decide how I felt. Proud, mostly. But also hollow, in that quiet way you feel when you realize someone you care about is meant to go somewhere you can't follow. That evening, we went out for dinner, nothing fancy, just the small Italian place near the office. We didn't talk much about her leaving. We didn't have to. It wasn't a breakup, it was just life moving forward in different directions. A few days before her flight, she stopped by my office one last time. She thanked me for helping her believe in her work again, for listening, for being steady. Then she said something I didn't expect: "You rebuilt yourself. Don't stop now just because the view finally got nice." After she left, the office felt different. Quieter, but not lonely. More like a space waiting for the next chapter to unfold. Over the next few months, I poured myself into the company's growth. We expanded into new regions, modernized our systems, and even won an innovation award that year. My name appeared in a trade magazine article about resilient leadership, which made me laugh out loud when I saw it. If only they'd known how messy the road had been. Still, success wasn't the full story. There were moments of stillness when I'd catch myself thinking about the path that had led here, the old job, the betrayal, the night spent wondering what the point of starting over even was. Those memories didn't sting anymore, they just reminded me how far I'd come. Then, about 6 months later, out of nowhere, I got a call from Leah. She said she'd be back in town for a conference and wanted to grab coffee if I was free. I said yes before she could even finish the question. When I saw her again, it felt like no time had passed, though everything about us had shifted slightly. She looked more confident, more grounded. We talked for hours, about work, travel, small stories from the in-between months. When it was time to go, she smiled and said, "You look happy, you know that." I told her I was. And for once, I didn't have to convince myself. That night, as I drove home, I realized that somewhere along this winding road of losing everything, I'd found something better than I could have planned, a version of myself that was content, self-assured, and quietly hopeful. Leah and I didn't make any big promises that night. We didn't need to. Some stories don't need declarations, they just need time. And as it turned out, time was about to bring one last surprise that would finally tie everything together. Leah's return wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of movie moment where two people run into each other's arms at the airport. It was quieter, realer. After that first coffee, we stayed in touch again, this time without the unspoken distance that used to hang between us. She called every so often, sometimes just to vent about work, other times to tell me about the little things, new clients, bad hotel breakfasts, how she missed the smell of rain back home. It was about 3 months later when she told me she'd decided to move back for good. Her firm had agreed to let her work remotely part-time, and she said she wanted to try building something steadier. She didn't specify what that meant, but I think we both knew. When she arrived, I offered to help her move into her new apartment. It was a modest place near the river, with uneven hardwood floors and windows that let in too much light. We spent the day hauling boxes, assembling furniture, laughing about missing screws and uneven shelves. At one point, she handed me a glass of lemonade, leaned against the doorway, and said, "You know, you look like you belong in your life now." It caught me off guard. I didn't realize how true it was until she said it. That night, we ordered takeout, sat on the floor among unpacked boxes, and talked about everything that had happened, the chaos, the choices, the unexpected turns. There wasn't some big confession or romantic declaration. It was simpler than that. It was two people who'd been through their own storms finally finding calm in the same place. Months passed, and the routine settled easily. My company continued to grow, and I started mentoring younger managers who reminded me of who I used to be, overworked, unsure, quietly drowning in expectation. I told them what I wished someone had told me back then, that progress isn't always about climbing higher, sometimes it's about learning to stand still without falling over. Leah's design project started overlapping with our company's marketing efforts, and soon enough, we were collaborating again. It felt familiar but better this time, no tension, no uncertainty, just trust. Somewhere along the way, working together turned into something deeper, the kind of partnership that didn't need defining because it just was. We got married a couple of years later. Nothing extravagant. Just a small ceremony on a hill outside town, surrounded by a handful of friends and family. Kevin wasn't there, though his name came up briefly in conversation, the cautionary reminder of how ambition without integrity can hollow a person out. As I stood there beside Leah, with the breeze tugging at her hair and the sound of laughter carrying through the field, I realized something I'd been slow to learn: all the losses I'd once feared, my job, my marriage, my sense of control, hadn't been endings. They were redirections. Every closed door had quietly pointed me toward a better one. Years later, I still think about that time sometimes. The empty apartment, the failed job, the hollow silence of betrayal. It all feels like a different lifetime now, a version of me that was still learning how to let go. I don't resent it. If anything, I'm grateful. It taught me how to rebuild, not just my career, but my sense of self. Leah likes to say I was the most cautious person she'd ever met until life forced me to stop playing it safe. Maybe she's right. Maybe some of us have to lose everything before we start seeing what's worth keeping. These days, I wake up early, make coffee, and watch the sun rise over the river from our kitchen window. It's not a fancy house, but it's home. The kind of home that doesn't depend on things going perfectly, just honestly. Sometimes I catch myself thinking about that email, the one that started it all, back when I had nothing left to lose. I'd almost deleted it, almost said no out of fear. But I didn't. And because of that single yes, everything changed. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: life doesn't always reward you for getting everything right. It rewards you for staying open, even when it hurts. And somehow, against all odds, that openness turned my worst season into the start of the best one.